Since this is now the end of the course, I can reveal a little bit of the inside of how we put these lecture series together. We think of a theme and then we say, well, what is there to say about this theme? And sometimes we don't know. And so as we were thinking about all the different aspects of Victorian life and so on, we said, wonder if there's an economic piece to this or a finance piece. I mean, after all, England was, all over the world and all these different colonies and so on, but did that change the way they were doing their financing and so on? So not knowing whether this was even a topic, what do? We call on friends. So we called Professor Alan Blinder here in Princeton and said, Alan, is this a field in economics? Should we include this in the lecture series? And he said, yes, you're on to something. And then we said, well, who should we call? We didn't know who to ask. And he told us we should call Professor Michael Bordeaux. And so that's how we extended the invitation. And so I'm glad to welcome him tonight. As you know from the program, he's a professor of economics at Rutgers University and directs a center for monetary and financial history. So there it is. There really is such a field. And he's the director of the premier center in that area. He's been a visiting professor at UCLA, Carnegie Mellon, Princeton, Harvard, and here it is, the connection to this course, Cambridge University, where he was the Pitt Professor of American History and Institutions. Now, he also got his start in higher education under the Queen. He went to McGill University in Canada for his bachelor's degree and to the London School of Economics for his master's degree, and then on to get a PhD at the University of Chicago. Now, he's also been a visiting scholar at the Federal Reserve in the U.S., and if you didn't know it, there's a Federal Reserve in Canada, where he also went, and then under the Bank of England, he was a visiting fellow. So I think he is extremely well qualified to be the final speaker in our program tonight. He's practically British, and he clearly is a leader in financial history. So we're very pleased to welcome him and thank him.
Well, actually, I'm Canadian, and and when I was growing up, I was a British subject. And when we got my first passport, when I went off to England in the early 60s, it said that if you're a Canadian citizen, you are a British subject. And then, of course, they got rid of all that. And now Canadians stand in the same queue going into the UK as Americans do. So, but this is how it used to be. And yes, so I studied at McGill, and in fact, talking about Queen Victoria, so if you've ever been to Montreal, you may have seen McGill campus. Well, you know that there's on Sherbrooke Street, which is just the main street that the university's on, there's an old building, like it's an old hall, and it's called Victoria Hall, and this was the women's dormitory, and in front of it, you've got this great picture of Queen Victoria. So I'm going to even show it to you because I think it's the same. Yeah. Okay, so right. So there's a picture of Queen Victoria, and I remember, going to college and sort of walking beside it. So, and also in Canada we had, it's not there anymore, but May 24th was the Queen's birthday. That was Victoria's birthday, and it was called Victoria Day. So there's a connection. There is a deeper connection actually than Ingrid thought there was. So this is a lecture about the Victorian age in economics, and I'm an economic historian, and there's a bunch of us at Rutgers that do this stuff. And this is actually one of the areas that I've done quite a lot of research in, is that period before 1914. I'm interested in the gold standard and the exchange rate arrangements that were then, but I'm also interested in globalization and that was also, Britain was the center of the first era of globalization. So that's what my talk's going to be about. And it's economics, but it's like the level of economics is, if you read the Economist magazine, there's nothing I will say that you wouldn't already know, or the Wall Street Journal, or even the New York Times. There's nothing, you don't even have to have Econ 101, okay? So I first want to just talk about London at its peak, in fact, the center, the British Empire when it was at its peak around 1900. So in 1897 was Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee, and this was her 60th year on the throne. And this is a picture of, actually this isn't a picture of her then, this is an earlier picture, but this is a picture of Queen Victoria. And at that time, the British Empire spanned the world, and British naval power was dominant. But even when I was a kid, I mean, when I went to school in Montreal, you didn't have the U.S. flag, you had the Canadian flag and the Union Jack, and you had this big map of the world, and the map had all these pink pieces, okay, and pink meant the British Empire. So it really did, that was what we looked at, and then before school started, at the beginning of class, we sang God Save the Queen. In fact, I was a kid, it was God Save the King. That's George VI, that's how old I am. But anyway, so the British Empire spanned the world, and British naval power was dominant. And Britain was the first country to have, an industrial revolution. And by the end of the 19th century, although it had been eclipsed in economic size by the United States, it was still one of the three premier industrial nations. And the city of London, and if you go there, you know it's that old little square mile that's sort of on the east of the West End, right? So the city of London was the center of global finance, and it still is. I mean, it's, along with Wall Street, is the center of global finance. And in 1914, Great Britain held 50% of the world's overseas investment. So that was like, it was extremely important. The city of London held the world's key capital markets. It had the markets for insurance, as well as for gold and other commodity markets. In fact, all financial markets, in a sense, global financial markets were in the city of London. And most of global international trade between all countries in the world, was financed by what are called sterling bills. These were these bills of exchange, which were sort of IOUs between the parties involved in trade. And these IOUs were issued by London merchant banks, by investment banks in London. So they pretty well dominated global trade. In fact, the United States, up until 1914, okay, if you were an exporter or an importer and you wanted to ship goods from New York to Hamburg or to New Delhi or anywhere, you couldn't work out a contract in dollars. Okay, there was no market for dollars. You had to make an arrangement with a British merchant bank in London who had a branch in New York. Okay. Or you could work with J.P. Morgan. J.P. Morgan's father was the first to set up the business in England, Junius Morgan, and so there was a direct connection through London. And London had at this time the most advanced and sophisticated financial markets in the world, and at the center of it stood the Bank of England, which was established in 1694. And it acted as the umpire of what's called the classical gold standard. And that was the international monetary regime, or the international monetary arrangements that linked together trade in goods and finance across the world. And what it meant was that every country would define their currency in terms of gold. we defined the dollar. In fact, our dollars were convertible into gold coin, and British pounds were convertible into gold coin. And the fact that the pound and the dollar were convertible into gold, and that gold, in a sense, the value of an ounce of gold was the same around the world, this meant that we had a system of fixed exchange rates, and that was called the gold standard. In a sense, England was the center of the system, and sterling, the pound sterling, was the dominant reserve currency. In other words, that all countries that had central banks would hold gold and they'd hold sterling. And that most international transactions that occurred, were invoiced not in dollars like they are today, but they were invoiced in sterling. Okay? And later, of course, the dollar took over, and today it's still very important. Central banks held, as I said, they held reserves in the form of sterling. In most countries, they held gold and pound sterling. Okay. And the period from 1880 to 1914 was both the heyday of the classical gold standard, under which, as I said, most countries define their currencies in terms of a fixed weight of gold, and that created a fixed exchange rate standard. And it was also, 1880 to 1914, was also referred to as the first era of globalization. And we think of that period, and we compare that to now, the period since about 1973, which is sort of referred to as the second era of globalization. And what do we mean by globalization? Well, it meant that in this period, goods, labor, and capital, or finance, flowed freely. That there was free trade. There were very few barriers to trade in this period. There were no restrictions on the flow of people, so there was free migration. And there were no restrictions on the flow of financial capital. Okay, they didn't have capital controls. Capital went from the centers which had low interest rates or low rates of return to high rates of return. And it's in this period that there were these massive capital flows from Europe, from Northwest Europe, from Britain, from the Netherlands, from France, from Germany, to finance the building of the infrastructure of the New World. And so this was the period when there was just millions and millions of pounds flowing from England or from France, but it always went through London. That was the sort of the entrepot to the United States, to Canada, to Australia, to Argentina. And this is, in a sense, how the modern world was financed. It was financed by capital from the old world with Britain being the center of it. And I want to give you a quote, which you can read, but look at it. This is a quote by John Maynard Keynes from a famous tract that he wrote called The Economic Consequences of the Peace. And he wrote this in 1919 when he was, in a sense, the tract was, in a sense, a diatribe against the Treaty of Versailles. And he was there as an observer, and he came away and he was absolutely disgusted with what happened. But this is a very famous quote that it comes up all the time if you look in the literature on globalization. So, the inhabitant of London could order by telephone, sipping his morning tea in bed, the various products of the whole earth in such quantity as he might see fit, and reasonably expect their early delivery upon his doorstep. He could at the same moment and by the same means adventure his wealth in the natural resources and new enterprises of any quarter of the world, and share without exertion or even trouble in their prospective fruits and advantages. Or he could decide to couple the security of his fortunes with the good faith of the townspeople of any substantial municipality in any continent that fancy or information might recommend. Keynes really wrote well, didn't he? I mean, there's nobody that can write like that. Okay. Okay, where was I? He could secure forthwith, if he wished it, cheap and comfortable means of transit to any country or climate without passport or any other formality. He could dispatch his servant to the neighboring office of a bank for such supply of the precious metals as might seem convenient. And he could then proceed abroad to foreign quarters without knowledge of their religion, language, or customs, bearing coin wealth upon his person, and would consider himself greatly aggrieved and much surprised at the least interference. But most important of all, he regarded this state of affairs, as normal, certain, and permanent, except in the direction of further improvement, and any deviation from it as aberrant, scandalous, and avoidable. The project of militarism and imperialism, of racial and cultural rivalries, of monopolies, restrictions, and exclusion, which were to play the serpent into this paradise, were little more than the amusements of his daily newspaper, and appeared to exercise almost no influence at all in the ordinary course of social and economic life, the internationalization of which was nearly complete in practice. So you can imagine, you watch Upstairs, Downstairs or something, they're having a rerun of it on Masterpiece Theater, and you have this understanding of how comfortable life was, especially if you were a gentleman and who had investments in the City of London. So this is the picture then of what it was like in the Victorian age. And here's a picture of Keynes. And I was at King's College, Cambridge, 4 years ago, and that's where his college was. And so there's some great pictures of him everywhere. But he really dominated that place, and you're there, and you sort of feel like this is part of, all this history sort of speaks to you. Okay. So, what's that? Okay. So the question is, how did this evolve? And where did all this pinnacle of power, what were the origins of it? And to do that, to really understand that, we need to go back 300 years to the Glorious Revolution of 1688. And that event, when they invited William and Mary to come over from Holland, and sort of settle this ongoing fight about whether the Protestants or the Catholics would have the British crown, and also the fight over whether it be Parliament or the crown that would dominate the affairs of Britain. Okay, so that event, in a sense, sort of settled that ongoing fight once and for all, and it culminated a tumultuous struggle between the crown and Parliament. And it ended with the victory of Parliament. And the Glorious Revolution created the conditions for the emergence of what's called the liberal order, of the supremacy of the rule of law and the sanctity of property rights, private property rights. And these events set the stage for a financial revolution which created the necessary financial background for the Industrial Revolution. Okay, and there were 5 sort of key elements of the financial revolution, and this is where I go into a little bit of economics. Okay, so the first was the creation of long-term bond markets, and after 1688, Parliament gained control of government expenditures and taxes. And in fact, that was what the whole of the Civil War in the 17th century was about, when Charles I lost his head. It was about who was going to be in charge. It also approved and guaranteed loans to the state. And this power, combined with the establishment of an efficient tax system based largely on excise taxes. And you need the taxes to service the debt. And that created the conditions for the government to be able to borrow massive amounts of money to finance and win most of 8 wars that took place between 1689 and 1821. And what the British did is they followed the example of the Dutch, who'd sort of figured out how to create bond finance, but they copied the Dutch. And what they were able to do, and this is I'm going to use one of the few jargon words in this talk, they were able to do something called tax smoothing. In other words, that during the war, big war, instead of having to raise taxes during the war to pay for the war at a time where you really need labor effort to be at its peak, and you don't want people to be, in a sense, shirking and evading taxes. So instead of jacking up taxes, you borrow money as much as you can, you issue long-term bonds, and then when the war is over, you raise taxes and pay off the debt. Okay, and this is what the British did. They invented this concept in the 18th century. And for people who are worrying about debt in the United States, you should listen to this because it's very important. And in fact, after the American Revolutionary War, the debt to GDP ratio for Britain was 100%. Okay, that's higher than it is now in either Britain or in the United States. After the Napoleonic War, it was 250%. Okay, that's a lot higher than any country in Western Europe. It's higher than Italy and Greece, etc. Okay, and compare this to France. Okay, France, which was in a sense the enemy, and most of these wars were fought against, they had a very inefficient tax system. They couldn't raise taxes, and they had a history of defaulting on their debt. So they couldn't issue bonds. They had a rough time paying for their wars, and they lost most of them. Okay? And it should be interesting that after each war, the British did pay back the debt. They raised taxes. Okay, that's what they did. And people just paid them. And the economy was deflated. And then they paid off their debt. And then, because they did that, in the next war that came along, investors knew that the British were good, that they would always pay back their debt. They had credibility. And that's how they got credibility. Okay. Now, the second piece of the financial revolution is the Bank of England. And it was established in 1694 to provide loans to the government. That was its main purpose. It was a joint stock bank. In other words, they could issue shares like a joint stock company today. And it had a monopoly on the issue of banknotes, which is what was used as a substitute for gold. And their notes had to be convertible into gold. And then some more economics jargon, it then later evolved into a banker's bank and a lender of last resort to the financial system. And it also used its monetary policy, its interest rates, to manage the gold standard. And this is a picture of the court at the Bank of England. And the third element is a banking system. And that evolved also in the 17th century from these goldsmiths, many of whom were Jewish, many of whom were Dutch, who would take deposits of gold from wealthy individuals, and then based on the gold, they would lend out. In a sense, people would have an IOU that would say that they had deposited gold with a goldsmith, and these IOUs then circulated as money. Okay, and these IOUs then evolved into something called banknotes. And then what happened was the goldsmiths realized that not everybody was going to come in at the same time and convert their IOUs into the gold that was being deposited. And so you had banknotes circulating which were less than 100% backed by gold. And this is the beginning of a modern banking system. Okay? And it was very important because and these were private banks. They were a key source of finance later for the Industrial Revolution, okay, and for the commercial and the agricultural revolution that occurred in the 18th century. And the fourth element, and actually I said five, but there are only four. The fourth element was the stock exchange, and this appeared also in this period, and it provided the needed capital to finance the nascent industries. I'm not going to talk about the story of the stock market because there were lots of crashes and panics and speculations and swindles, etc., and it had a very rocky history, but it evolved into a very important institution. Okay. So the financial revolution was important because it provided the resources to finance the agricultural revolution that allowed British agriculture to become much more efficient, to release labor, to move into the Industrial Revolution, okay, and to provide large profits to the agricultural sector, also which were then invested in industry. Secondly, it helped finance what's called the Commercial Revolution. Part of that's the growth of ocean shipping that occurred in the 17th and 18th century. And also a key part of that was the slave trade, which was a very major source of British wealth. And if you go to Bristol in England, you'll see there are evidences of that. Okay. And it provided the capital needed for the Industrial Revolution. And this is a picture of dark and satanic mills I think it was a glass factory in the north of England. And Britain became, by the middle of the 19th century, Britain becomes a mature, advanced country. Sustained growth generated the savings which financed the development of the rest of the world in the first year of globalization. And during this era, the Victorian era now, the City of London becomes more sophisticated with the advent of merchant banks to finance international trade, what were called bill brokers who dealt in bills of exchange. These are these IOUs I mentioned earlier. Discount houses, which evolved from the bill brokers and who purchased and rediscounted commercial bills. In other words, they made loans on the basis of the collateral of these commercial bills. Also, commercial banking expanded after 1826 when joint stock banks other than the Bank of England were first permitted. But the Bank of England still kept a monopoly on the note issue, and so these banks became what are called deposit banks, which is basically the kind of commercial banks we have today. The Bank of England in this period emerges as a true central bank. Its interest rate, the discount rate, which is like the discount rate the Federal Reserve has today, and that's where the idea comes from. Okay, it served as the anchor for interest rates for the rest of the financial system. So just like today, federal funds rate is the interest rate which is the anchor in which all other interest rates are tied to it. Well, this whole system started in Britain in the middle of the 19th century. By 1873, the Bank of England had learned to become a lender of last resort. That meant that it learned to provide liquidity to the banking system when there was a financial crisis. just like the one we had in 2008. Okay, so they were the first to figure out what to do. So Ben Bernanke was doing things that the Bank of England developed 150 years ago. And there were lots of banking panics in the 19th century, about every 10 years. And the bank learned by about the third quarter of the 19th century to begin following what's called Bagehot's rule. And this is named after Walter Bagehot, who was the editor of the Economist magazine in the third quarter of the 19th century. And he was very critical of some of the mistakes that the bank made earlier in the 19th century, because the Bank of England was a private bank, but it also had a public purpose. And up until about the 1860s, when there was a financial crisis and a squeeze for liquidity, the bank would be thinking more about its shareholders than about the other people in the financial markets. And so often they would get out okay, but a lot of other players would fail. And so Bagehot criticized them heavily in The Economist, and then he wrote a famous book called Lombard Street, where he talked about what a central bank should do. And what came out of that book is sort of a mantra for central banking for today, which is called Bagehot's Rule, which says the bank should lend freely, but at a penalty rate. In other words, that if there's a demand for liquidity in the heat of a crisis, the bank should just discount whatever paper comes to it. It should lend freely on the basis of sound collateral, okay, and not ask any questions. Just pump the money out there, but do it at a penalty rate, which meant that do it so that the rate of interest at which you lend is higher than the interest rate that you could get in the market. Okay, and when they began following this rule, they didn't have any more panics. The last British banking panic ever was in 1866. Compare this with the United States. Okay, in this period, the U.S. had 4 serious banking panics between 1873 and the founding of the Fed in 1914. And then even when we had the Fed, we had 4 big banking panics in the 1930s. Okay. Let me then sort of, finish this off. So the question is, what happened after Victoria? Well, in the years after the turn of the 20th century, Britain was overtaken by Germany and the United States as an industrial power. And it wasn't that Britain stopped growing. It was just that the other countries grew faster. And also Britain began to lose its military edge to Germany in this period. And then World War I came along, and that was an economic disaster for Britain. That much of the war was financed by cashing in outstanding foreign assets. So all those chits that the British had in the United States and everywhere else in the world, they cashed them in to pay for the war. Okay, they also sold their gold stocks. And they borrowed heavily from the United States, and they ended up actually printing money to capture what's called the inflation tax. This is a way of, in a sense, paying for wars. When things get really bad, you just run inflation. And what happened was also during the war that the gold standard broke down. Okay? And then after the war, the city of London tried to restore its former glory and recreate the dominance of sterling. And Britain went back to the gold standard in 1925 at an overvalued parity. That meant that its exchange rate was worth a lot less than they thought it was worth. It meant that British prices had not fallen. They had a high inflation during the war, and prices had not fallen, so that British goods, were not competitive with goods from most of its trading partners. And so what happened was it tended to run persistent current account deficits. In other words, it kept, in a sense, spending more than it was earning, and it was importing more goods than it could export. And in the face of that, it faced continuous deflationary pressure. In other words, there was this downward pressure because it was losing gold, and the Bank of England kept raising interest rates, causing a recession. And so the 1920s was a pretty bad time. In fact, Keynes wrote another famous tract called The Economic Consequences of Mr. Churchill, which indicted Churchill's policy for going back to gold at the original pre-war parity and creating the high unemployment that they prevailed in Britain in the 1920s. In fact, when you think of the Great Depression, we always think of the United States, we think of the 1930s. In the 1920s, okay, the UK had 20% unemployment running right throughout the 20s, and they were worse off in the 20s than they were in the 30s. And what happened during this period is the U.S. became the dominant economic power and also took over from Britain as a source of international capital. So the mantle was passed from Britain to the United States in the 1920s. The dollar became the dominant reserve currency, and it still is. Okay, so this goes all the way back to the 1920s. And then sorry, I was a little slow on the PowerPoints. And then World War II came along and finished off Great Britain as a world economic power. After the war, the empire disappeared. The economy was seriously depleted by the costs of the war. Sterling still played a role as a reserve currency for what's called the sterling area, which was what was left of the British Empire. And similar to the years after World War I, Britain ran persistent balance of payments deficits and had sluggish economic growth all the way until the 1980s. Sterling was devalued twice in 1949 and 1967 in the face of serious currency crises. The last devaluation that occurred in and also in the second crisis in 1967, the United States advanced billions of dollars to try to save the pound, and it didn't work. Okay? The last devaluation in 1967 ended sterling's role as an international currency, and that was pretty well it. I mean, the empire was gone. It was no longer an international currency. Of course, and then it got hooked in with Europe, and its history has now been tied in with Europe much more than with the rest of the world. So let me conclude with a question. So what are the lessons for the United States? The first one is the obvious one, and that is empires never last, no matter how glorious they were. The second lesson is that the second era of globalization, from 1973 to the present, has fostered the growth of emerging market countries in Asia and elsewhere. So the growth rates of China and other countries greatly exceed that of the United States, just as the U.S. and Germany outgrew Great Britain a century ago. And in the not-too-distant future, the Chinese economy will be as big as the United States, probably within 10 years. And eventually, the level of per capita GDP will converge on ours. That won't happen in 10 years. That'll happen if everything works well for the Chinese, maybe in the next 40 years. So that's the second lesson, which is in a sense very similar to what happened if you were to compare the United States to Britain 100, 150 years ago. The third is that economic power is closely connected to military power. And as our relative strength declines, we're going to have to rethink, in fact we're already doing it, our role as the policeman for the world. And Britain went through exactly the same kind of exercise in the 20th century. So we can conclude by saying that the 19th century was Britain's century, the 20th century was America's century, the 21st century will likely belong to the emerging countries. Okay. Thank you.
I think we'll take some questions, but let me thank you because people sort of tend to go out now. for coming and giving us this lecture tonight, which not only answered our question about is there a financial piece to all of this, but you gave it a wonderful closing for the whole series. So we are very grateful to you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Professor, I was interested in your comment that the Bank of England was a private bank with a public interest. Could you comment on the relationship of the financial community to the rise of the British Navy in the course of the century?
Let me think about that. Okay. The financial sector was very important. What the British did beginning in the 18th century is they would finance the Navy through these, in a sense, IOUs, which were like T-bills. Okay, but they were called ordnance bills. So they actually the Royal Navy could issue this debt. It would sell the debt to merchant banks and other banks who would then market it to the public. And so the financial sector was extremely important in financing the growth of the British military. And the Bank of England was part of this. So what happened during the Napoleonic Wars was that the British government, in a sense, sold the short-term debt to the Bank of England. The Bank of England would then, in exchange for the debt, would just set up accounts for the Navy and the Army in the Bank of England, and then they could write checks on it. Okay, now this was very inflationary, and what happened was in 1797 there was a run on the pound, and Britain had to temporarily suspend the gold standard because the government was, in a sense, using the Bank of England and then the financial sector to pay for the war. Yeah.
Maybe you just answered it, but why didn't the British finance World War I with borrowing in their own country?
They tried. I mean, they went through these stages. Okay, the first thing they did was they had all these outstanding claims around the world. So they used those because what they had to do was to buy war material from us, okay, and raw materials and everything else. But they also issued a lot of debt. I mean, they financed most of the war by issuing debt, okay, but it wasn't enough. Okay, then they ended up having to run the printing press, and they had a 250% inflation. Yeah.
Well, educate me on my ignorance on the gold standard, on pros and cons. You mentioned earlier that the gold standard allowed fixed exchange rate and boosted free trade, international trade. And there were some people, such as William Jennings Bryan, presidential candidate, vociferously against the gold standard. His famous speech, "You shall not crucify mankind under the cross of gold." In a few words, what is the downside of this? There was such controversy over it.
Okay. Yeah, I used to teach a course in U.S. financial history at Rutgers, so I know all about that. There's a huge debate. It still goes on about the gold standard. Okay, and the gold standard, the benefits of the gold standard are that in the 19th century it gave us a fixed exchange rate regime, as I said. Secondly, it had a way of anchoring prices. And so you would have, in a sense, prices would rise and fall for short periods of time, but you couldn't have massive inflation. Okay, but the downside of gold was that it depended upon, the gold standard depended upon there being enough gold coming out of the ground to finance the growth of world trade. Okay, and what happened in the 19th century was the world was growing faster than the amount of gold that could cover that could finance the growth of the economy. And so there was a tendency towards deflation. Okay, and what William Jennings Bryan was upset about was that in the period from around 1870 to 1896, the U.S. and everybody on the gold was going through deflation. Okay, and deflation can affect people. It tends to create winners and losers. So if you're a creditor and prices are falling, the real value of the loans that are owed to you are going up. If you're a debtor, e.g. a farmer, okay, and you owe mortgages on your land, prices are falling, okay, the value of mortgages go up. Okay, and so Bryant was, in a sense, understood this, and there was this large populist movement, the free silver movement, in the 19th century, which argued that if we had silver instead of gold as our standard, that we would not have falling prices because silver was more plentiful than gold. Okay, so the argument for free silver was an argument for inflation. Okay, and so William Jennings Bryan was an inflationist. Yeah.
To the gap between the really wealthy and the poor people in England at that time, and how that relates to growing gap here now?
I mean, this was one of the things that happened. I mean, there was always a very adverse distribution of income. Okay, it used to be that you had, you know, these titled landowners, the lords and landed nobility, that owned all the land. Okay, and everybody else was, in a sense, you know, part of the feudal system. And so this evolved over time into, with the Industrial Revolution, et cetera, as the feudalism broke down, and so you had the middle class emerging and some people being very wealthy, okay, and you've also had a lot of people who were released from working as serfs on the land to working in the factories. These people were much better off than they were when they were peasants or serfs, but they still were relatively poor. And so what happened in the Industrial Revolution is that the distribution of income actually improved, but it didn't look very good because you still had a lot of very rich people. In fact, what happened was with the development of the middle class, you had more wealthy people than you did before, and these were people who were in commerce and industry as opposed to people who had just inherited land. But so there was an adverse distribution of income. This always happens when you have an industrial revolution. Okay.
Now we have this incredible growth of very wealthy Americans. Salaries paid to, just an article the other day in the Times about the salaries that Wall Street and the attachments of industry in our country, whatever that industry being passing patiently on. Do you see something happening socially as a result of that?
Well, it's the American dream. No, actually, to be serious, the distribution of income has become more skewed in the United States, but what's really going on is that people who are highly educated, especially educated, technically educated, okay, their incomes are rising a lot more than those who are not, and that's going to continue. And that's picking up very deep-seated forces, not just the recent tech boom or Wall Street or any of that. That's picking up globalization, okay? And people who have educations, good educations, are not losing. It's those that do not have those educations, and they're losing. And the problem, as I see it, is deficiencies in the U.S. educational system. And we're losing relative to the rest of the world. That is the real problem. It's not that a bunch of guys made a bunch of money on Wall Street. Okay, that always happens. There are booms and there are busts. But the trends are picking up very important gaps that are opening up in the labor force. Okay, they're affecting millions and millions of people, and this is not going away. And it won't go away until we do something about it. Yeah.
To overcome the disparity of gold and the gold standard, you just have to adjust the rate. There's not enough stuff coming out of the ground. Just raise the price of gold.
That's what the French thought. No, in the 1960s, no, really, there was a big debate about that, and the French solution to the problem of the Bretton Woods system was just double the price of gold. The problem with that, with the gold standard and doing that, is it creates what's called incredibility. So the reason the gold standard worked so well was because the price was fixed and everybody was fixed to it. Everybody, all countries were, in a sense, committed to keeping the price fixed. What was called the gold standard rule was keeping the price fixed. And changing the price of gold then opens up the following question. Okay, if we changed it once, why aren't we going to change it again? Okay, and so
Essentially, that limits wealth. There's a limit to how much gold you can get. It's essentially that the gold standard, you can't change the rate, limits wealth. You've got other sources of wealth.
no, what it does is it it creates, as I said before, a stable price level or deflation. But it doesn't limit wealth because wealth and money aren't the same thing. Okay, it doesn't affect the productivity of capital. Okay. But it does act as a straitjacket. And that's one reason why we got rid of the gold standard. Okay, and that's why going back to the gold standard is not a good idea. Okay, and I know there are a lot of people who, not maybe in this room, but there are people that think it is. But we can do better under what's called the fiat money standard, okay, if we have rules which are like the gold standard, but don't have the straitjacket of the gold standard.
You talked about how England is now obviously more oriented towards Europe than to the old British Empire, but it still resists using euro as its form of currency. Could you briefly tell us what the pros and cons are of going over to the euro in England?
Okay, I mean, part of it's just nationalism. Okay, it's just leftover nationalism, anti-France nationalism. And the Euro project was a French project, largely. French and German, but the French were behind it. So there's always been this distrust in England about the French. And if you've lived there, you know it's there. Okay, that's one reason. And that's the sort of popular thing. It's the continental. And the British have always thought themselves as different than the continental. So that's one sort of low-level reason. The second reason is that if you just think about the crisis that Ireland, Portugal, and Greece just went through, right? What's that all about? Well, part of it, a good part of it, is the fact that if you have a problem like Portugal has of being uncompetitive, okay, Portugal is a country that its economy is stuck at about 1950. Okay, they're in the textile age. Okay, and what happened is they joined the euro, and they suddenly ended up with German prices. Okay, Germany is in a very advanced country that, in a sense, passed the textile phase 120 years ago, and so Portugal has a big problem. Its exports are uncompetitive. But what would have normally happened if Portugal were an independent country and not part of the euro system is they would devalue their currency. And that would allow them to get out of the trap that they're in. Okay, and Ireland, same boat. Okay, Greece is another story. They're also, not only do they have a competitive problem, but they also have a credibility problem. So Greece would be in a free fall if it didn't have the euro. Well, the Brits think like that. They know that having their own currency, sterling, gives them the flexibility to allow the exchange rate to decline and to take off some of the deflationary pressure that happens when you have a big shock like the global recession we just went through. Okay, and so the British are reluctant to give up the pound because they would give up monetary policy and they would give up any independent role for the Bank of England. That is the main reason why they're opposed.
I think maybe we'll end the evening and thank you again, and thank everyone for coming.
Okay. And that's one reason why we got rid of the gold.